Hi, class. We are already on the lecture, The Literature Search. So, as you remember, we've been going through the steps of the research process, and we've uncovered or finished the tool about generating hypotheses. So, now we're going to talk about the literature search. And this is a very straightforward and practical lecture. I remember back in the day when I was an undergraduate, oh my gosh, finding articles was so hard. It was so confusing. And so I said, if I am ever a research methods teacher one day, I'm going to help students make it a little easier. So I'm going to tell you some tips and tricks and strategies on making the literature search work for you. So here's our outline. We're going to talk about the literature search. 4 types of sources. There are sources vary widely in quality, and I want to make sure that we only use the top quality research sources in this class. Then we're going to talk about the very best sources, which are scholarly sources. Then we'll probably take a break and come back and talk about search strategies and what do you do with your articles once you find them. So the literature search. Most important thing is have a plan. Don't just walk in the library and think, well, I'm going to find some articles. That's the easiest way to get completely distracted. Kind of know what you're looking for. So have an idea about your question. You don't have to have it formalized yet, but you want to have a pretty good idea of what variables you're interested in and how you're going to look for your question. Now, I want to state right now that this particular semester, I'm helping you out a lot. I'm giving you a bibliography with a lot of research on the topic of dogs. Now, you'll still need to find some of your own articles, and those are to fill in what I'm giving you. So you want to know your question. What about dogs are you going to study? How are you going to fill it in? What information do you need that I haven't already given you? And then determine your key search terms. And this is a little tricky. Sometimes you might call something one thing and somebody else might call it something different. One good example would be love. If you use the search term love, you're going to get a whole bunch of things. But you need to think about ahead of time, what kind of love are you thinking of? Are you thinking of romantic love? Are you thinking of spiritual love? There's all different ways that love has been defined. So the best thing to do is to find an article that describes it exactly how you and your group are thinking of it, operationally, that it operationally defines it. So for example, if you're looking for kissy romantic love, then you're going to find an article that talks about that, maybe mate selection or dating, and then check out the search terms of that article, because chances are that the author has struggled with the same issues that you have, and they found, either with help with their editor or help from a librarian, how to categorize their article in the term that's accepted by the discipline. So that's a really easy way to find the search terms that are going to really help you, and you're not going to get all this random stuff that doesn't relate it to the way you're really thinking of your construct. So don't just use words. Use words that have been already defined by the system to be the right words. And the easiest way to do that is to any article you read, right below the abstract is going to be their search terms. And if you use those, you're going to get a lot closer to where you want to be. So determine your key search terms and then search your citation index. And I've got a little video that I've posted to help you guys use OneSearch at UH Manoa. That will help you find a lot of things. Depending on your topic, you might want to look at other videos. I really like to use Google Scholar, but with Google Scholar, you have to be very specific with your search terms and use that advanced term a lot. For example, I study stress and I have to make sure to put in psychological stress, or I get all kinds of chemistry and physics, heat stress and speed stress and all kinds of different things. So I need to make sure to put psychological stress when I use a broad search term like Google Scholar. And I also put up a link to the HDFS subject guides on the library, and that'll put you give you some good starts for if you want to use something besides OneSearch or Google Scholar. It'll give you some ideas. So you're going to pick a citation index, and that's where you start looking at your search. Then you're going to read the titles and the abstracts. So really quick, you're going to skim over the titles and the abstracts of the articles you found, and you might have to be a little bit ruthless here. You're going to delete the irrelevant articles. What I do is I just have learned after so many years, especially with all this great citation indexes and electronic searching you can do, you can get a lot more articles than you need. So at this stage, you want to be pretty picky, very selective on what types of articles that you want to include in your paper. So you can delete irrelevant articles, even if they're interesting, even if they might be if they're kind of peripherally related. You want to be very picky and stick to the articles that are the closest related to your topic. I guarantee you it won't be hard to find 5 or 10 articles that you need. Now, one thing that I do sometimes, if I'm not sure, or if there's an article that's really interesting and I want to read later, I'll put it in another folder. I'll make a folder on my desktop and I'll save, to read later, or keep this around because it might help later on in the project. So you don't have to absolutely delete them, but if you're not sure, I recommend you're better off going less is more at the beginning of the search and just save those other articles in another folder if you want to use them. Then you're going to get the sources, and nowadays it's as easy as clicking a button. Most of the articles that we need to use can be downloaded if you go in through the UH Manoa Library site. There are other ways to get those articles. If they don't have them at UH Manoa, you can try an interlibrary loan. And one of the links that I put up for the library guides shows you how to do that. But that can take a couple weeks. So keep in mind the time frame of your project if you have the time to get that article that you have to do an interlibrary loan for. The librarians call it ILL, interlibrary loan. But it can be, sometimes the perfect article is the one that you need to get that way. So just start early and realize that it may take some time to get your relevant sources. Then you're going to read them. And this is the time that you're going to go through most of the article. So before you got rid of the stuff you didn't want to read by just scanning the titles and abstracts, now you're going to read the article. And in lab, you're going to learn a technique for taking notes on articles that'll make them really useful to you as you write your paper. Then you might have to refine your question. You might go, oh, you know what? That's already been answered by this article I read. But they didn't answer it in an ethnically diverse population like we have here in Hawaii. Or they defined self-esteem a little differently than I would define self-esteem. So you might refine your question, make it a little more specific so you don't duplicate that work that's already been done, that your research is unique. And then you might have to go around a couple more times. This is an iterative process. But this is a good guide for the search, and it really helps if you go in, think efficient, don't get distracted, and do your search. So this is a good guide to help you out. Next, we're going to talk about 4 types of sources, and these are sources that your book talks about. And basically, they're the good, the okay, the bad, and the ugly. And this is very important because one of the things that we faculty often talk about in faculty meetings is we want to make sure that our students graduate knowing how to appreciate good quality research. And one of the most basic parts of that are being able to recognize a good source from a bad source. And politically, and I'm going to get all general here about society, there are sometimes people don't recognize the truth or what's not the truth, or conspiracy theory versus a good source. And so it's really important to have these critical thinking skills for society in general and for your job success. So basically, when you look at something, the first question you should ask is, should I believe this? Why should I believe this? Is it relevant? Is it giving me good information that's supported by evidence? And one easy way to think of it are the 4 types of sources. And the first type is, and I'm going to go from bad to good. So the first type is at the bottom of the food chain. This is bad, and they're called sensational sources. And you can see on the right side of your slide, I've given you an example in print, an example of a web source. These are sensational. The purpose of these sources are just to get attention, really. They want to sell products. They want to cater to popular superstitions. They want to give the people what they want. They use very basic reading the words. The reading level is very basic. They use elementary language. And if you look at it carefully, it's designed to kind of inflame your emotions. Stars with cellulite, or Jen cheated on again. Not, it's very appeal to your emotions and not your brain, because they really don't want you to realize that they're not backing up their statements with sources. Or if they do say sources, they'll say, people tell us. Well, who are these people? Were they there? Did they see it? Are they making things up? So those are the sensational sources. They're pretty much gossip. They often use newspaper format. And as you might guess, they're not acceptable in research papers. The second type is the popular source. And as you can see, I've got on the right an example is Parents Magazine. I know a lot of professionals in human development aren't really wild about some of these popular sources, because their purpose is really to entertain the reader and sell products. They're not to make sure that everybody's an excellent parent or to give the best information. They put things very, very simply, but they're very pretty. They're slick and attractive, but they're don't give us much evidence. They might cite one person, but they wouldn't cite a body of research. So examples of those were Parents Magazine or the Today Show. Now, I'm going to stop for a minute and first tell you that these are not the kind of sources that I want to see in the papers, but also sometimes these can be good sources of ideas. You might see an article in Parents Magazine or a short segment on the Today Show that talks about something that's interesting to you. You don't have to ignore it completely. What you might do is look at some of the clues that they give you in the material from them that you look up, and think about how can you find more information on the same topic with a better source. So for example, on the Today Show, I see this really interesting segment on vaccinations. And they happen to mention Dr. Smith from Cornell University. Well, Today Show, I can get kind of a general view, but I want some good evidence-based quality research information to use. So I look up Dr. Smith at Cornell University, and I see that he has a faculty page with a list of all the articles he's published. And in that, he has his co-authors and the journals, and we think, wow, that's a great place to start. Really good place to start. So popular magazines, while they're not the best, don't ignore them. They're out there and they're in the real life, but you need to do a little bit more work if you're interested in something that you find out about from one of these sources, because they're not the best. The next is substantive. These are still attractive magazines. I mean, who wouldn't want to read a magazine with a picture of a gorilla taking a picture on the cover? I mean, seriously. They're attractive. They sometimes cite their sources. They cite their sources a little more than the popular type. Their language geared to an educated audience, but they're still published by commercial enterprises. So they want to make a profit. So they, in some sense, want to give the people what they want to hear. And their purpose is to provide information to a broad audience. So these are okay. I would never cite one in one of my papers, but sometimes they can be helpful. Again, like the popular sources that I mentioned before, you might get great ideas, and these are going to give you more information to look up. While, for example, the Today Show might just tell you Dr. Smith from Cornell University, National Geographic or WebMD might cite a couple of scholars that you could look up, or they would give you more information about that person's research and a little more evidence. So when you started finding the real research, the original sources, you would have a better understanding of things than if you had read a popular. So that's the substantive. So far we've got the sensational, which is bad, the popular, which is okay, the substantive, which is a little bit better. So we're SPS, and then our fourth one is scholarly. I have no idea why that happened. There was another book here. There it is. Scholarly. These articles have a serious look. These articles mean business. You can tell from the cover. I mean, that cover is not to have fun. That cover is to give you information. That cover contains solid research. They always cite their sources. So they're basically just very advanced research papers written by experts in the field. Their articles are written by specialists and experts in the field. But because of that, they often use discipline-specific language. And what I mean by that is they use language, my husband, who's an attorney, calls it a term of art. They use terms of art. They use language that's very, very specific to their discipline. And as such, someone who hasn't had a lot of training in that discipline might not understand it. So I'll give you an example. Attachment. If you're in a journal on developmental psychology, especially if they're looking, at the whole entire lifespan, when they use the word attachment, they don't mean my keychain is attached to the key, right? That's not what they mean. When they say attachment, they're really referring to attachment theory. And you have to have a little bit of educational background before you can understand that the real meaning of that discipline-specific language. Most of the time, they report on original research. I'm going to give you an exception in a couple of slides. That means they write up the whole study. They show you exactly how the study was done. You know the exact hypothesis, you know the sample, you know how the constructs were measured, you know what statistical analyses they used, you know how sure they were that their results were not due to chance. And then that you get a really good discussion done by an expert where they talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of their research and put it in the context of the field. So this is really, really good stuff. And this is the stuff that you want. Because if you remember way, way back to the first day of class, it already seems like years, doesn't it? We talked about research that was generalized. So the research on college students and music was generalized to completely the wrong population because people weren't reading the original sources. The original sources told them that original study wasn't done on babies. But because people didn't look at those sources, they kind of got out of control with how far that research could generalize. So these are really important. I want nearly all of your sources in your projects to be from scholarly sources, and they are published by professional associations. So they're not for-profit. I'm on a journal board right now, and we don't make a lot of money, but it's really important because we want the world to understand our research. Why do I keep doing that? So these are the only types of resources you should consider using in your scholarly paper. Now you try it. Okay, so remember we've got 4 types. SPSS. It's sensational. Sensational, popular, substantive, and scholarly. What type of source is each of the following? And you might just get a piece of scratch paper out here and note on your paper. Try to guess, give yourself a little practice, because this kind of stuff is definitely on the quiz test, both. Sports Illustrated, old cover. Makes us sad to look at now. What kind of journal is Sports Illustrated? That's popular. How about Women's Wear Daily? That's a little bit tricky. That's a trade journal. So even though it's definitely not a scholarly article, because it's the quickest way that you can learn about fashion trends, I would probably accept that if it were directly related to your topic. Developmental Psychology. We used this one already. You can tell by the cover. It is a scholarly journal. That journal means business. Star Magazine. Yep, sensational. Do you think that James Garner at 83 is a pothead? Really? What is a pothead? Anyway, doesn't it give you a lot of trustworthy information? Brain tumor drama, shocking public romps, low quality language, and low quality information. Journal of Industrial Textiles. Yes, scholarly, definitely. That's going to give us first-rate information on different textile qualities. People. I'd say that one probably close to sensational. I'm not sure if Dumbledore is gay or Hermione has a sex tape. People is, in this case, definitely sensational. Wikipedia. Tricking you. Wikipedia is sort of sticky because it gives you a lot of information and pages vary in their quality. So what I think about Wikipedia is to use it to get ideas. I still sometimes get ideas from Wikipedia, information on basic processes. Every once in a while with my stress research, I'll forget what a hormone does or how it combines with other hormones, and so I'll look it up on Wikipedia. But I will also pay very close attention to how many other sources the Wikipedia article cites. So if it's a good article, they're going to have a lot of sources on the bottom that you can go refer to. And often I do if I want more information or just to double check the nuance of what they told me. So I don't think Wikipedia is evil at all. I think it's a great first stop, but I think you need to follow through. So I'm going to tell you a little more about scholarly sources because I want you to understand them, because they're the main ones that I want you to have in your projects. Some more details. The first type of scholarly article is a primary source. And that's the one that I was thinking of when I described the articles under these scholarly types of information. They're journal articles, they're detailed, and they may only present a big piece of the picture. And they're also current, but they're not as current as you might think. So these are the kind of articles that I generally write. And let me tell you about an article that we just had come out last week. So the article was on self-efficacy in grandparent caregivers. And we did a questionnaire in grandparent caregivers. And by grandparent caregivers, I'm talking about grandparents who are raising their children without that middle generation. And every time I talk about this in class, I have somebody who comes up and tells me, yeah, my mom's doing that for my brother or sister, or my grandma's doing that, or my auntie's doing that. And it's really hard. And it is hard. And so there's a lot of research articles on these people's experiences and how we can make their lives easier and enable them or empower them to give their grandchildren the best care possible in a difficult situation. So back to our article, we collected data. We did a project with grandparent caregivers, and it was a 5-year grant, and we got about $1.2 million to collect this data. We had 2 teams. We had one in Hawaii and one in Colorado. And not to tell you all the details, but we collected data from about close to 400 grandparents who were raising their grandchildren. One of the things we collected from them is how confident they felt in caregiving. And I think we finally got all the data. The study, we had 3.5 years of different workshops we ran with these grandparents. And they did pre and post questionnaires because we wanted to say how much they changed after participating in our grandparent program. So we had all of this data. We got it in. It took us close to 3 years to gather it all, 3.5. We got it in about 1.5 years ago. And within the first 6 months, one of our graduate students in Colorado wrote a paper, just like you guys are going to write, using this data. So her introduction talked about grandparent self-efficacy, and her hypothesis, pretty sure, was something around the grandparents who feel empowered about their role would be less depressed than other grandparents. And so she wrote the literature review, and then there's about 3 of us other professors, some in Colorado and me here, that proofread and edited and worked on the references and helped her with that literature review. Then she analyzed the data, and we professors helped her with that. So she already knew about the samples. She just wrote up the details of the grant on how we collected the data. The methods, she talked about the questionnaire that we did on the whole grant. And then the procedure, also the same grant. And then the results section, the statistical section, she ran herself. We double-checked that, and then we all wrote the discussion. So we wrote the paper. Probably it took us about 6 months because there was all that back and forth between people in the team. She submitted it to a journal editor, and the journal editor said, the journal editors have 3 decisions they can make. They can accept your article right away. It's only happened to me twice. Very, very rare. They can revise. They can give you a revise and resubmit. And that's basically, they have a bunch of comments, they write on it, they send it out to reviewers who are 3 different professors around the state or around the country, and they're anonymous. You don't know who they are. They send it out to reviewers. The reviewers give you comments for improving. And so when you get a revise and resubmit, you've got about 6 months to send it back, actually 3 months to send it back and improve it. And then the editor gets it again. It goes out to all those reviewers, and they say whether you've met their comments satisfactorily or not. And at that point, after second review, they can also decide to accept it or reject it. And then you also can get a rejection at the very first time. So when you first submit a journal article, you can get 3 things happen. Accept, very rare; revise and resubmit, rare, but it happens; and then reject, which is the most common. And if you get your article rejected, you just try another journal. You rewrite your article and you make it better. So the reason I told you all of that stuff is because when you say journal articles are current, they're not research that happened yesterday. They're usually a year or 2 old, and that's because the publication process takes some time. Because science is a community of scientists, and so the community has to agree that your work, that your research is worth sharing with the world. So anything you read in a primary source or any journal article has been looked at by a bunch of experts who have used their expertise to determine that this is the best scientific knowledge possible. So that's really cool, right? The best information you can get. But the problem of it is, it's, as I said before, it's not always current, and then also it may only present a piece of the big picture. Because as you may remember from our lecture on asking questions, hypotheses have to be very, very narrow. They have to be very narrow and very specific. And as you might have gotten the hint from the lectures we've had so far, is we also have to be very, very careful about our definitions. And so even though an article can be excellent science, it only really tells you about the sample that you used and how you measured things and the conditions that were in that study. So that's why we like to say the cycle of science, you remember the cycle of science, is that it takes a lot. We need to gather a lot of information to really understand a phenomena or even make a theory. So primary sources are excellent. They give you the best research possible, but they do have two little flaws. They're not as up to date. For example, it took a couple months even to get good COVID research out because it really took us out by surprise. And then they may only represent a piece of the big picture. Now, secondary sources, so primary sources tell you about the study. Secondary sources can also be scholarly sources, but they're review articles in journals or books. And what happens in review articles is an expert in the field reads a bunch of articles, selects, finds, and reads a bunch of articles on a topic, and they integrate them. Because like I said, one study only tells you about that original research. If there's something that has a lot of knowledge accumulated on it, an expert will read a bunch of original sources and write kind of an opinion or an overview on overall, what does this research say? What are the strengths and weaknesses? What do we know about the phenomena of interest after reading all of these single studies about it? So those also require peer review. They have the same process of the submit, revise and resubmit, go back to the reviewers, and then make it better, and then submit again, which you hope is accepted. So depending on the focus of the articles, they may or may not talk about the methods used, but they're always high quality because they've been looked at by a lot of reviewers and they've been written by experts. And they're good information. And what I really like is when I find a review article about my topic, especially a super duper recent review article, because that gives me kind of a shortcut, catches me up with the research. And sometimes I'll often look at the articles that are cited in the review article. I'll go back and look them up to give me a little more information. So review articles can be really good information. They're always better in a journal than they are in a book because journals are more likely to be peer edited. They're more likely to go through a rigorous review process. And then there's books and edited books. Those are also scholarly. They're written by experts, but they're only reviewed by maybe one or two editors. So they're not quite as specific, not quite as rigorous. So journals are pretty much always better than books. Journals are better than books, but the good thing about books is because they get more space. Journals are really expensive to publish. Remember I told you that they're nonprofit organizations that publish journals. So journals are saving paper. They're saving money, they're saving paper, so they want your article to be as concise as possible. Where books don't have quite that constraints, that books, the authors of books can spend a little more time describing things, describing the background, describing related factors. So sometimes a book is easier to read. So I prefer journals definitely, but if you find one or two books and can find an article, that's okay because they're easier to read, especially when you're just starting out like you guys, because the stuff can be really hard. All right, so let's stop now and we'll come back in a couple minutes and talk about the search strategies.